At my own wedding, I watched my wife's family tear my mother apart with a single sentence right there in front of 204 people. That's not a mother. That's a mistake in a dress. They laughed. My fiancé laughed. And for the first time in my life I didn't. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and ended the wedding before the cake was even cut. People gasped, cameras froze, someone dropped a glass. But that wasn't the shocking part. What came the next morning, the part no one saw coming, is what made their entire world collapse. And all because they thought they could humiliate the one person I die protecting. My name is Merrick Hale, and this is the story I've been afraid to tell. But before I share it with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments so I know you're listening, or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Thank you. And now let me tell you everything. And if my story touches you in any way, please consider subscribing. It means more than you think to someone who's finally learning to speak up. At my own wedding, I watched my wife's family tear my mother apart with a single sentence right there in front of 204 people. That's not a mother. That's a mistake in a dress. They laughed. My fiancé laughed. And for the first time in my life I didn't. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and ended the wedding before the cake was even cut. People gasped, cameras froze, someone dropped a glass. But that wasn't the shocking part. What came the next morning, the part no one saw coming, is what made their entire world collapse. And all because they thought they could humiliate the one person I die protecting. North Crest Estate looked like money had tried to build a fairy tale and overshot. High ceilings, white columns, double staircase curling up either side of the foyer like something out of an old movie. The chandeliers poured out warm gold light that somehow made the room feel colder, not cozier. Out back, the garden was staged for photographs more than people, white gazebo roses that matched the napkins. A string quartet tucked under a tent playing songs no one was really listening to. A documentary crew floated through all of its cameras on gimbals, catching every toast, every fake laugh, every air kiss. The Aldridgides didn't just want a wedding. They wanted an artifact, something future grandkids could watch and say, "Look how perfect we were." I sat at the head table in a tux that fit like armor and drank water from a crystal glass like it might be the only thing keeping me from drowning. I don't drink at events like that. I need my head clear. It already felt less like my wedding and more like I'd been cast to play the role of groom in their family documentary. I kept glancing at my mom, Linda, sitting on my right. She'd altered her dress herself the night before, taking in the waist, shortening the hem, smoothing every line until it looked like it had always been meant for her. The color was soft and neutral, the kind of shade that doesn't demand attention and still somehow glows. Her hair, of course, was perfect. Low bun, soft curls framing her face. Nothing flashy, just skill. That's the cruel part. The one thing this room full of people actually respected, technical beauty, was the one thing they'd never give her full credit for. Her hands rested on the tablecloth, fingers laced. I could see the small calluses along her knuckles, the fine white line on her thumb from where she'd once sliced herself on a pair of cheap shears. Scars nobody in this room would ever notice, let alone understand. I picked up the thick wedding booklet and started flipping. The Aldridge section came first, obviously. Gregory Aldridge, chair of Aldridge Development Group, member of this and that city board, patron of half the arts organizations in Charlotte. Victoria Aldridge, philanthropist, keynote speaker, founder of some initiative with a polished acronym. There were black and white portraits of long-dead men in suits on the walls around us, labeled founders of the Aldridge legacy like they were gods carved into marble. Then came my page. Merrick Hale, self-made founder of City Pulse Labs, born in a working-class zip code. Proof that talent can come from anywhere. Read like a pitch deck. Not wrong but not right either. Then at the bottom, the part that mattered most to me and least to them, Linda, local hairstylist, community spirit. No last name. No mention of 30 years paying rent on time, of 3 jobs, of never once missing a parent-teacher conference, no matter how tired she was. Just local hairstylist, community spirit. As if her entire life could be folded into a tagline for a neighborhood flyer. It clicked, then sharper than it had before. They wanted my story just gritty enough to make them look generous, but not specific enough that my mother became a person with a history. Just an accessory, a texture. Behind us, someone at the next table whispered. I heard his mom never even got licensed. Just learned on her own. Wild, right? Another voice chimed in, amused. Our gardener plays piano by ear too. Some people are just like that. The string quartet kept playing, but the only thing I really heard was the word gardener pressed up against my mother. She kept eating small bites of her salad, smiling, that thin practiced smile I knew too well. The one that said, "It's fine, honey. We'll get through this too." Gregory stood up to give his speech, and the room settled instantly. He had the kind of presence that made people sit straighter, not because they respected him, but because they understood he controlled things that could hurt them later. He raised his glass and said, "Tonight is not only about two young people coming together. It's about a story of success being written in real time." He launched into my biography like he owned the rights. From a tiny strip mall salon in Akron to a cramped apartment in Chicago to Northwest Estate where dreams become reality. If I'd been watching this on a screen, I might have rolled my eyes. Sitting there, I just felt numb. I used to be proud of that arc. I'd worked for it, but hearing it come out of his mouth, all I could hear was a sales pitch for the American dream and for the Aldridge brand. The moral of the story wasn't that my mother had scraped and clawed to get us out of that apartment. The moral in Gregory's version was that a system like his could take someone like me and polish me into something worthy of their ballroom. I watched my mom's jaw tighten one fraction of an inch, watched her swallow hard, and I knew she heard it too. Then Victoria took the mic. Her voice was soft and sweetened. The kind of voice that makes people lean in. "Merrick is proof." She said that talent doesn't depend on a zip code. Some people are born in the right neighborhood, some aren't. But with grit, with perseverance, you can rise. She paused, smiling in my direction, then let her gaze drift to my mother. And of course, a lot of that gift must come from his mother. The golden hands, the ability to work with your hands to stay connected to ordinary people. That kind of gift doesn't come with diplomas. Sinead. People laughed softly. The polite, knowing kind of laugh that says, "We understand our place above all that." The words themselves could have been a compliment. In her mouth, they were a velvet-lined cage. Golden hands, ordinary people. Every label pressed my mom further down in the invisible pyramid this room ran on. My mother set her fork down very carefully and smoothed her napkin. That was her tell. Don't stand up. Don't make a scene. Don't bleed in front of people who enjoy the color. My chest felt tight. I pushed my chair back and slipped away from the table because if I didn't, I was going to either vomit or start breaking glassware. In the side hall, the music sounded further away like someone else's life. I could hear waitstaff calling out table numbers. The quiet whir of the documentary crew's equipment. One of the cameramen caught my eye. "You good man?" he asked low enough no one else could hear. I stared straight into his lens for a beat too long and didn't answer. Somewhere in that camera was a frame of my face. I knew I'd remember, jaw set, eyes flat, tuxedo perfect, something inside already cracked. On my way back toward the ballroom, I heard Victoria before I saw her. She was standing in a side corridor with Caitlin and another guest, a glass of champagne balanced in her fingers. "The bride looks couture," she said lightly. When she walked in, I thought, now that is Aldridge elegance. The groom's mother, though, honestly, I assumed she was someone's plus one. That's not a mother. That's a mistake in a dress. The laughter was soft, sharp, the kind that cuts deeper because it pretends not to. I stopped dead. My lungs forgot how to work. Caitlin laughed too. That high, easy laugh I'd once loved. "Mom, seriously," she said, but there was no heat in it. Careful. Someone might actually get offended. She wasn't defending my mother. She was managing optics. The same woman who'd once told me, "If the world falls apart, I'll be there, I promise," was now standing comfortably on the side that held the knife. That was the moment I knew something had already broken beyond fixing. I walked back into the ballroom and straight to our table. I leaned down to my mom. "We're leaving," I said quietly. "Let's go." Her hand snapped to my wrist. "Merrick, no," she whispered. "It's just one night. I can take it." Across the room, Caitlin was already hurrying toward us, heels clicking against marble. "You're overreacting," she hissed under her breath when she reached me. "This is just how my family jokes. They do it with everyone. Don't ruin our day over a few comments." I looked from her to my mother to Gregory and Victoria at their table to the documentary crew repositioning near the dance floor, ready for the next big speech. For the first time in my life, I stopped worrying about being polite. I walked up to the microphone. The band quieted. The chatter dimmed. Someone in the crew signaled to roll. They thought I was about to make a toast. "Thank you all for coming," I said, voice steady. 204 heads turned toward me. "Thank you for the reminder, too. Tonight made it very clear exactly what kind of people I never want to become." A wave of uneasy laughter rippled through the room, then died when no one followed it. "This wedding is over," I said. "You can finish the drinks. The marriage stops here." For a second there was absolute silence. Then it shattered. "Is he serious?" Someone whispered. "That's the City Pulse guy, right?" Another voice hissed. "Is this some PR stunt?" Victoria stared at me like I'd spoken in a language she didn't recognize. Gregory's face went red then white. Caitlin's lips moved my name maybe or a curse, but nothing came out. I set the microphone down, walked back to the table, and held my hand out to my mom. "Come on," I said. "We're done." "You don't have to do this for me," she murmured as we walked out, her fingers trembling against my palm. I didn't answer out loud, but the words burned in my chest. "I'm not doing this just for you. I'm doing this because of you. Because of what you taught me, I don't have to swallow." By the time we reached the car, North Crest Estate had already started to shrink in the rear-view mirror of my mind. They thought I'd just thrown my life away over one sentence. They had no idea that tomorrow morning when I walked into Aldridge Tower, the real story would start. Maple Lane Diner is open 24 hours, 7 days a week, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, it feels like the only place on earth where time sits down and takes a breath. The neon sign out front buzzed tiredly as I pulled into the lot. Inside, the laminated menus were still sticky in the same places. The counter was still chipped along the edge where someone had once dropped a mug. It smelled like burned coffee, fryer oil, and sugar. The exact same mix that had followed me through half my childhood. The waitress behind the counter looked up as we walked in, and I saw it in her eyes. Recognition, and then the quick, polite decision to pretend she didn't. I was still in a tux. My mom was still in that mistaken dress. We took the booth against the wall. We always took the one with the rip in the vinyl patched with duct tape. I ordered black coffee. She ordered hot tea with lemon. Sitting there under buzzing fluorescent lights after walking out of North Crest Estate felt like being slingshot back 15 years to another night when everything felt too big and too uncertain. I stared at the napkin dispenser and suddenly I was 16 again in a cramped 2-bedroom unit above a dying strip mall in Akron, Ohio. From our window you could see the parking lot lights buzzing over cracked asphalt. The kind of place where store signs went dark one by one and nobody ever replaced them. In winter, the wind slipped through the window frame, no matter how many towels we shoved along the sill. Mom worked downstairs in the salon and I did my homework at a beat-up table we'd bought from a closing diner. I remembered the winter the heater died and the landlord took 3 weeks to fix it. We boiled water on the stove and filled big bowls so we could wash our faces in something that didn't sting like ice. Mom wrapped my hands around a mug and joked, "Spa treatment. This is how you get good skin, kid." She always framed survival as some kind of bargain we were winning, even when we both knew we weren't. She worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs back then. Morning shift at the salon in the mall. Evenings doing house calls for clients who tipped in cash. The odd wedding gig in some bellist banquet hall where the carpet was always patterned and the DJ always too loud. I remember coming downstairs once between appointments, finding her asleep, standing up head, leaning against the supply closet door, a comb still tucked behind her ear. She woke up before I could say anything, checked her watch, and moved on to the next client like nothing had happened. At home, she cut coupons with a pair of dull scissors, and drank tea from a plastic travel mug because coffee is for people who don't have to check the price before they pour it. When I was in middle school, kids at school used to say, I always smelled like hair dye. One day, a boy laughed and called me salon boy loud enough that half the hallway turned. I went home furious, embarrassed, shoving my backpack harder than necessary into the corner. I told Mom I didn't want to do my homework on the floor between hairdryers anymore, that I was tired of smelling like chemicals. I expected her to apologize, maybe to say she'd try to keep me away from the salon more. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron, sat down across from me and said, "If they smell hair dye, it means I still have a job. I'm sorry if that makes it harder for you, but don't you dare be ashamed of me. Be ashamed if you hurt somebody. Be ashamed if you lie. Don't ever be ashamed of the fact your mother works." That was the first time I understood that most of the shame I carried wasn't actually mine. It was what other people projected onto us and what I'd been quietly agreeing to. Years later, when I stood in North Crest listening to Victoria talk about golden hands and ordinary people, that middle school hallway came rushing back. In high school there was this field trip. Our class walked through a redeveloped part of town that used to be vacant lots. There were benches placed at strange angles too far from any tree too close to the street. One girl raised her hand and asked the city guide, "Why are the benches crooked?" "There's no shade." The guide shrugged. "That's just the design." I couldn't help it. I blurted out because whoever drew this cared more about checking a box than whether anyone would ever sit here. The teacher looked at me longer than usual and asked, "You ever thought about architecture, Merrick?" That was the line right there between just getting by and imagining I could change something. Later, when City Pulse Labs was just sketches and late-night code, I kept thinking about those crooked benches and sun-bleached lots and wondering how many decisions like that got made by people who never walked the streets they redesigned. And before any of that, there was this diner. Mom and I ended up at Maple Lane one night after the salon had a terrible week. The landlord had raised the rent on the mall, foot traffic was down, and the owner had cut her hours. We had just enough cash for one slice of pie and one small coffee. The waitress split the slice without us asking. Mom pushed the bigger half toward me anyway. "Tomorrow when you're writing that essay," she said, "remember, there's something sweet waiting for you if you keep going." I was 16, tired, and pretending not to notice that she hadn't ordered anything for herself. Sitting in that same booth now, Tuck's tie loosened my mother's makeup, slightly smudged at the corners of her eyes. I realized this diner wasn't just a place we ate when we were broke. It was our origin point, the coordinates everything else could be measured from. I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug, and another memory slid in on top of the rest, one I'd filed away for years. I was about 16 when the strip mall changed hands. New ownership, new signs. The old faded logo on the pylon came down and a sleek new one went up. Stylized in deep navy, a name I didn't pay attention to at the time. Lease renewals came with higher rent. The salon owner cut Mom's hours. We spent a month thinking we were going to have to move in with some cousin 2 towns over. That stylized didn't mean anything to me then. Later, when I walked into Aldridge Tower for the first time and saw that same letter gleaming behind the reception desk, it hit me like a delayed punch. People like Gregory made decisions from conference rooms that shook our apartment without ever knowing our names. Mom sipped her tea across from me now. Her dress still immaculate despite the hours and the humiliation. She looked smaller in the harsh diner light than she had under the chandeliers, but also somehow more real. "You know," she said softly, "you could still call it a mistake. Say you got carried away. People forgive a young man who panics on his wedding day, especially when he's successful. You don't have to set your whole future on fire because of me." I shook my head. "I didn't set my future on fire," I said. "I walked out of a life where I couldn't stand the person I'd be if I stayed." I didn't tell her about the other plan yet, about the months of quiet moves I'd been making in the background. My phone buzzed on the table. An email notification lit up the screen from Lawrence Drayden. Subject: "All documents executed. Ready for board presentation tomorrow." I opened it with my thumb. The words were clean and simple. Every transfer completed, every signature notarized. The shell companies I'd set up over the past months now held a controlling stake in Aldridge Development Group. I looked up at my mother, at the tired woman who'd been called a mistake in a dress in front of 2 under 4 people. And I thought, Tomorrow in Aldrich Tower, she won't have to lower her head for anyone, whether they like it or not. Chicago was the first place that ever felt like more than survival. My entire studio could have fit inside the foyer at North Crest Estate. The mattress almost touched the radiator. The rain rattled the window every 20 minutes. And the pipes clanged like ghosts fighting in the walls. But for the first time in my life I looked around and thought I chose this. I was 24, splitting rent with a friend from college, eating dollar slices and instant noodles and building City Pulse labs on a second floor in Fulton Market that still smelled like whatever had been stored there before us. We took over half a converted warehouse, exposed brick concrete floors, desks made from reclaimed doors balanced on metal sawhorses. In the winter, we worked in hoodies and fingerless gloves with space heaters pushed under our chairs. The coffee we drank was strong enough to strip paint, but it kept us going when the city outside the warehouse windows felt like it would rather spit us out than let us change anything. City Pulse started as a simple idea. My friend Eli and I joked about over cold pizza. What if there was a way for neighborhoods to flag dead spaces on a map, then send that data straight to city departments and funders? Not glossy master plans drawn in offices miles away, but a live feed of here's where the kids cut through to school and here's the lot where everyone dumps trash. We wrote code between freelance gigs glued together. APIs built a feature that let people upload photos of empty lots and vote on proposals. For a long time no one cared. Then in year 2, a small architecture blog did a write-up on an alleyway we helped turn into a pocket park. They called it a new way for communities to co-design their own cities. That article got picked up by another site, then a local news channel. A small fund in Chicago invited us to pitch. We walked into a boardroom in thrift store blazers and walked out with a seed check that made my hands shake when I signed the paperwork. After that came an angel investor, then a pilot project with a West Side ward that had more boarded-up windows than grocery stores. We entered a competition to design a public space in one of the roughest districts in the city and somehow won. I remember standing in that empty weed-choked lot watching kids from the neighborhood climb on the temporary structures we'd installed and thinking, I'm not just escaping Akron. I'm trying to change all the places that feel like Akron baked into concrete. That's when the invitations started. Panels, conferences, innovation and urban renewal, tech for cities. One of them was a big urban planning summit downtown. City Pulse had a small slot on stage. Aldridge Development Group had a keynote. I didn't care who they were at first. They were just another logo on the banner. Then I ended up on a panel with one of their executives, a woman named Caitlin Aldridge. She introduced herself as if everyone already knew her family, and in that room most people did. The panel was supposed to be about mixed-use development in emerging corridors. She talked in clean numbers, internal rates of return traffic flows, commercial viability. I talked about benches that didn't burn your legs in August, sidewalks lit enough that a nurse working nights could walk home without pretending she wasn't scared. She said ROI is how we keep these projects sustainable. I said, people are what make anything sustainable. If they hate your plaza, they won't use it, and your return drops, no matter how pretty your spreadsheet is. The audience laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that means someone just said something true they weren't sure they were allowed to agree with. Afterward, at the coffee station, we found ourselves reaching for the same stale cookie. She smirked and said, "You treat architecture like art." I told her I treat it like something that should stay standing and actually serve the people who live around it. That's art, fine. She rolled her eyes in a way that felt more impressed than annoyed. I grew up around pro formas and zoning reports. She said, my parents don't understand why anyone would obsess over a single park bench. I'd like to learn what that feels like. We got dinner that night at a noisy place in River North. We argued about public-private partnerships over tacos, then ended up walking along the river until the wind cut through our coats, and she finally admitted she was freezing. Somewhere between the first drink and the last train, respect turned into curiosity, and curiosity turned into whatever you call that moment when you realize you're already picturing someone sitting across from you in 5 years, not just next week. For a while it was just that. Long-distance calls between Charlotte and Chicago weekend flights, text messages with photos of half-built plazas and skylines. When she invited me to come down and spend a weekend at her parents' place, it felt huge, but in a good way, like being invited backstage after playing a small stage and having the headliner say, "Come meet the band." The Aldridge house in Charlotte looked like someone had tried to build a museum and then decided to live in it. Glass walls, steel beams, water features so carefully choreographed they felt fake. There were paintings in the hallways I'd only ever seen in magazines. Mom was terrified. She wouldn't admit it, but I could see it in the way she kept smoothing her dress in the plane seat. She'd taken an extra shift at the small salon in Raleigh, where she'd picked up weekend work just to afford the ingredients for the box of pastries she baked for them. She polished her outlet store shoes until they shone and practiced saying, "Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge" instead of "Sir and Ma'am." When we arrived, Victoria took the pastry box between two fingers like it might still be hot. "Oh, homemade," she said, drawing out the word. "Charming." Gregory shook my mother's hand and gave her a politician's smile. "Thank you for raising such a remarkable son," he said. "Especially with your workload." It sounded like a compliment until you heard the implication that it was surprising someone like her had produced someone like me. Mom smiled the same thin line she'd worn under the chandeliers at North Crest, and her fingers tightened around the handle of her purse. Like if she let go, she'd float right off the marble floor. At dinner in their glass-walled dining room, Gregory asked about City Pulse, but his questions weren't about the tech or the neighborhoods. "Your background is very compelling," he said. "People connect with that. A kid from a strip mall salon, now a tech founder building parks. There's real narrative value there. We could highlight that when we go in front of city councils." Victoria nodded along. "So maybe we frame you as the kid from the strip mall salon in our materials," she said. "It shows how far the right ecosystem can help someone rise." Caitlin tried to steer it back toward design. Asked me about a plaza concept we'd built on the south side, but every time I answered, Gregory dragged it back to my origin story. I felt less like a potential partner and more like a mascot they were deciding how to pose. After dessert, Caitlin pulled me into her father's study to show me a slide deck on his computer. "This is the Lincoln District proposal," she said. "We're pitching it to the city next quarter. I think you'll like some of it." I scrolled through and my stomach dropped. Half the concept looked almost identical to a speculative study City Pulse had done for a different city, one I'd shared with her months earlier over a bottle of wine and a laptop just to show her what I was dreaming about. Street trees in the same staggered pattern, seating nooks carved into existing building setbacks. I flipped to a later slide and froze. There was my circulation diagram, the one I'd sketched in a notebook on a train one night. Same colors, same arrows. Only the City Pulse logo in the corner had been replaced with a bland line community design partner. "Where's our name?" I asked, my voice flatter than I meant it to be. Caitlin shifted her weight. "My dad thinks your app isn't mature enough to put front and center yet," she said. "He doesn't want to confuse the narrative, but you're the inspiration." I've told him that. "Really?" I heard what she said. Inspiration, not collaborator, not owner. I told myself to let it go, that this was a foot in the door, that things would catch up later. That night, back in Chicago, long before the wedding, I woke up to the sound of Caitlin's voice in the kitchen of my tiny apartment. I was half asleep on the pull-out couch just out of sight. She was on the phone with someone laughing softly to keep from waking me up. "My dad loves his story," she was saying. "The kid from the strip mall. The mom in the salon. The app for empty lots. Makes every pitch feel real." Pause, then a lower tone. "Sometimes I think he likes the story more than he likes the actual company." The words landed like a weight on my chest. I lay there with my eyes closed, breathing as quietly as I could while she finished the call and came back to bed. I didn't say anything, but something had shifted from that point on. Every time Gregory called me our self-made founder, I heard subtext ours to use, ours to showcase when convenient. Mine apparently only as long as I didn't make trouble. I started asking questions after that. Not loud ones, not yet. I met up with an old classmate who worked in private equity, bought him coffee, and asked how a family company like Aldridge was structured. He drew boxes and arrows on a napkin, explained voting shares and minority stakes, and how sometimes the people in the brochures weren't the ones actually holding the reins. If you're going to let them use your name, he said, you might want to make sure you have some say, otherwise you're just the inspirational story in their deck. On the flight back from Charlotte one weekend, I opened my laptop and started looking at public filings for Aldridge Development Group. Names of small shareholders popped up. Retirees' minor funds, people who'd been in since the early days. I didn't know what I wanted yet. I just knew I didn't like the idea of my life being reduced to a bullet point someone else controlled. Months later, sitting in Maple Lane Diner after walking out of my wedding, staring at Drayton's email on my phone, all those nights and conversations fell into place. The cheap coffee, the Fulton Market warehouse, the glazed look in Gregory's eyes when he talked about narrative value, the slide where my logo had vanished, the late-night phone call where Caitlin admitted her father loved the backstory. I hadn't set out to destroy their house of glass. I had only ever meant to buy back my part in the story. Whether the rest of it shattered when I pulled on that thread was never really up to me. A month before the wedding, before the flowers and the string quartet and the sentence that snapped something in me, I flew down to Charlotte for what Gregory called a historic day for Aldridge. That was his language, not mine. My language for it now would be simpler the day I stopped pretending I was part of the family and realized I was part of the inventory. Aldridge Tower stood in the middle of uptown like a glass spine, reflective panels catching the skyline, the lobby all polished stone and controlled temperature. I checked in with security, took the elevator up, and stepped into a conference floor where everything smelled faintly of new carpet and overbrewed coffee. I'd been there enough times by then that the receptionist greeted me by name, but there was still a subtle difference between how staff looked at me and how they looked at Gregory or Caitlin. With them there was a tilt toward difference. With me it was curiosity, like they weren't sure yet whether I was going to be a permanent fixture or a limited-time exhibit. The boardroom had floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the city, the kind of panoramic view companies like to use as a metaphor for transparency. I'd already learned that seeing everything didn't mean you understood what was going on. The agenda for the day was printed at each seat. Lincoln District Green Corridor Presentation, Strategic Partnership Announcements. My name wasn't listed anywhere. I was in the room as guest, not speaker. Still, when the meeting kicked off, Gregory made a point to gesture toward me. We've been exploring ideas with some fresh players in the civic tech space. He said, Merrick here has been an inspiration for how we talk about community Demerick design. Inspiration again, not partner, not co-lead. The slides went up on the wall and there it was. The Lincoln District Project neighborhood maps, renderings of shaded walkways and plazas, bullet points about data-informed activation of underused lots. The City Pulse methodology was all over it in everything except name. At one point, a line in smaller text read, in collaboration with a grassroots innovation partner. I knew exactly who they meant, and I knew exactly who they had erased. Later in the meeting, as they moved on to budgets, I glanced at a packet that had been left half under my folder. It contained internal talking points for the city council pitch. One phrase jumped out at me. We have worked closely with emerging platforms like City Pulse Labs, whose founder's journey from a strip mall salon upbringing to tech leader illustrates the potential impact of Aldridge-supported ecosystems. That was how they saw me, as proof their ecosystem worked even though they had never built anything that had actually changed the block where I grew up. When the formal presentation ended, staff shuffled papers and I used the lull to flip through the Lincoln District contracts. 3 subcontractors were listed for implementation. I had never heard of any of them. No websites in the footer, no portfolio images in the appendix. When I asked Gregory casually about them, he said, long-time partners. They understand how we move. In the hallway afterward, one of the younger analysts, kid in his 20s, tie, slightly loose eyes sharp, fell in to step beside me on the way to the elevators. He spoke without looking at me. 2 of those contractors don't have office addresses, he said under his breath. Just P.O. boxes. No online presence. If you try to find their previous work, you won't. Then louder, like he just remembered something innocuous. He pointed at a framed photo on the wall and said, great shot. Right as someone walked past us. My skin prickled. It wasn't just that they were using my work without giving credit. It was that they might also be using my name and my app's reputation to cover something rotten. Later that day, in the underground parking garage, I confronted Caitlin. The concrete walls amplified the echo of our footsteps. Why wasn't I on the agenda? Yes. If Aldridge has been working with City Pulse, why wasn't I presenting with your team? She blew out of breath, looked away, then said, "My dad thinks it's better if you're positioned as a story, not a technician. It plays better if you're the example we point to, not the one digging into the spreadsheets in front of council members." "And the slide where my diagram used to have our logo," I said. "Why is City Pulse suddenly just a nameless grassroots partner?" "He doesn't want to confuse the messaging," she said. "He thinks your platform isn't at scale enough to withstand scrutiny yet. Once things are more established, we can make the relationship more explicit." The words sounded rehearsed. They might as well have been printed on Aldridge letterhead. "So right now I'm a prop," I said. "Clean arc for your deck. The kid from the salon who proves your model works." She flinched. It's not just that," she said. I care about what you do." Maybe she did. But caring about what I did and protecting the way her family packaged me were clearly two different things. A few nights later, I was back in Aldridge Tower waiting for Caitlin to finish a late meeting so we could grab dinner. The floor had mostly cleared out. Lights dimmed. The city spread out below us in cold glitter. I was scrolling through emails on my laptop when the printer across the hall, word to life, spitting out a handful of pages. 10 minutes passed and no one came to claim them. On any other day I might have ignored it. That night, something about the quiet hum of the machine and the way the pages lay their face up pulled me in. The top sheet read, "Strategic Narrative Optimization, Internal Use Only." I know I shouldn't have read it. I did anyway. The document broke down different assets in the Aldridge story. Multigenerational leadership, philanthropic footprint, ties to local institutions. One bullet point lower on the page made my fingers go cold. Emerging figure Merrick Hale, profile founder of City Pulse Labs, working class background, single mother, household ties to legacy challenged neighborhoods. Recommended usage case study and upward mobility ideal for humanizing large-scale proposals. Risk unpredictable in unscripted policy discussions. Strong personal convictions. Recommendation: do not place in roles requiring message discipline during regulatory negotiations. I stared at the line "ideal for humanizing large-scale proposals" until the words blurred. I had known on some level that I was a narrative piece for them. Seeing it laid out in bullet points right under the same font they used for cost projections and zoning variances was different. I set the pages back on the printer tray exactly the way I'd found them and walked out. The glass walls reflected my face back at me in the dark. A man wearing a suit that fit, carrying a laptop worth more than the car my mom drove when I was a kid. Eyes that looked exactly like the boy who did homework on a salon floor. If I didn't draw a line somewhere, these people were going to turn my entire existence into a fable they could sell to city councils while they funneled money through companies that didn't even bother to make websites. That night in my hotel room, I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles. My phone lit up on the nightstand. I picked it up and scrolled to Drayden's number. It was almost 11 when he answered, his voice rough with sleep. "Merrick, we're done talking about this like a hypothetical." I said, "You still think it's possible for someone like me to quietly build a position in a company like Aldridge if we're careful?" He said, "If we do it through the right vehicles at the right pace." Why? I looked out the window at Aldridge Tower glowing against the skyline. "Because if I don't protect my own name and work, they're going to rewrite my whole life into a story that serves them," I said. "And I'm not going to let that happen." He paused, then said, "Then we start this week." When I hung up, the room felt very still. The fan kept turning. Somewhere down below, cars moved along streets designed by people who would never walk them at midnight. I thought about my mother boiling water on a broken stove in Akron, about the benches in that half-finished park in Chicago. About the slide where my logo had disappeared, about the memo that labeled me as an asset with a risk factor. If I stayed quiet, they would own every version of me that counted in the world they moved in. If I spoke up, I might burn every bridge I just spent years building. Chose anyway. Drayden's office in Chicago was the opposite of Aldrich Tower. No glass walls, no city view, just shelves of binders, a dying ficus, and a conference table scarred with ring marks from too many cheap coffees. He listened without interrupting while I laid it all out. North Crest, the memo on the printer. Lincoln District being turned into a case study with a pulse. When I finished, he leaned back and steepled his fingers. Aldrich Group has a lot of small shareholders, he said. Old guard investors, minor funds, people who got in early and have been ignored for years. Performance has been flat. Payouts look good on paper, but once you dig into the projects, he shrugged. Disappointment ages people fast. So what are you saying? I asked that I start buying a few shares and send a strongly worded letter. He shook his head. I'm saying if you buy in the right places at the right time through the right vehicles, you could quietly accumulate 40, maybe 50% of the voting shares before anyone in that tower realizes you're more than a decorative success story. I stared at the grain of the table. I was a kid who grew up doing homework between hairdryers, not some corporate raider. The idea of controlling interest felt abstract and ugly. But the image of that memo wouldn't leave me alone. Ideal for humanizing large-scale proposals. Too risky and unscripted settings. I'm not trying to stage a coup, I said. I just want to make sure my mother doesn't become a prop in a story they own forever. Then buy yourself a voice, he said. They already bought your image for free. We set up 3 shell companies in Delaware the way everyone did when they wanted to be everywhere and nowhere at once. On paper, they were boring investment vehicles with forgettable names. In reality, they were basement where I stacked bricks of influence one by one. I poured in everything I could. Personal savings. The Profit City Pulse had finally started to turn the kind of money a Cronmerrick would have thought belonged in mythology. We went after the small holdings first. Retired engineers in Charlotte, a teacher in Raleigh who'd inherited a block of Aldrich stock from an uncle, a mid-sized fund in Ohio that had grown tired of glossy annual reports that never matched their gut. One afternoon, I sat at a kitchen table in a modest ranch house outside Cleveland, across from a man in his 70s. His hands shook slightly as he signed the transfer forms. "I'm selling," he said, "because I don't trust Gregory anymore. He talks a good game but the numbers don't line up. A company that clean doesn't hide this much." He slid the papers back to me and added almost to himself, "Something's going to give over there. Better it's him than the people he built this thing on." Walking back to my rental car, I realized Aldrich had been rotting from the inside long before I showed up with my backstory and my app. I wasn't breaking anything that wasn't already cracked. Back in Chicago, my life narrowed into airport spreadsheets and half-finished conversations. I flew to Charlotte, to Columbus, to Houston, ticking off shareholders, signing documents, shuttling money through the shells Drayton managed. At home, Caitlin watched the light leave my face and drew her own conclusions. "Are you freaking out about the wedding?" she asked one night when I stumbled into my apartment after a 48-hour triplet still smelling like recycled plain air. Her eyes were rimmed red. "Because if you don't want this, I need you to say it. I can't be the only one planning our life." I opened my mouth and nothing came out. My brain was full of share classes, voting thresholds, and a color-coded spreadsheet that showed how close we were to a line no one at Aldrich knew I was approaching. "It's not you," I managed finally. "I'm just trying to make sure things are solid before we step into all of it." "Solid how?" she asked. I couldn't tell her that the man she was about to marry was quietly building a lever big enough to move her family's empire. I couldn't tell her that every time her father said "we" in a boardroom, I wanted to see actual numbers to match the word. So I kissed her forehead, told her I was tired, and watched a little more distance settle between us. Weeks later, Drayton called me into his office again, a stack of printouts already waiting. "Your friends were right," he said, tapping a page. "The financials are off. Cash flow on Lincoln District is negative in a way that doesn't match the official narrative. Funds going out to entities with no track record, no infrastructure. If there's real work being done, it's invisible." I took the pages home, spread them across my kitchen counter, and followed the columns until my eyes hurt. It was like watching a map of clean streets laid over the memory of a neighborhood filled with potholes. The gaps were obvious once you stopped believing the legend. That night, an email hit the General City Pulse inbox. No sender name, just a scrambled address I couldn't trace. If you want proof, it read. Check this folder. The Empire is standing on plaster and paper. There was a link to a shared drive. I clicked it and a new set of documents opened. Internal cost breakdowns. Invoices from the same nameless subcontractors' payments routed through layers of shell entities whose only purpose seemed to be confusion. The total on one project came in millions higher than what was visible in any public filing. Work logs were missing. Site photos stopped halfway through. Whoever had sent it knew exactly where to look and exactly how Aldridge hid their excess. Someone inside the glass tower had finally decided to point a flashlight inward. By the time the wedding week rolled around, the numbers in my own spreadsheet lined up in a different direction. Through the 3 shell companies, I held just under 48% of Aldridge Group's voting shares. One more decent block and I'd cross a threshold that would change everything. 5 days before the ceremony, as florists and planners spammed my phone with confirmations, Drayden sent a short message. A mid-sized fund in Atlanta wants out. Their stake puts you over 51 if you take all of it. They're tired of Gregory. Decision needed today. I sat alone in my Chicago office looking at the city lights through dirty windows. Phone in my hand, heart pounding. I thought about Caitlin and Charlotte picking linens and playlists. I thought about my mother hemming her dress and telling herself she could endure one fancy night for my sake. I thought about Gregory calling me an inspiration while he scrubbed my name from his slides. I wired the money, signed the forms, watched the confirmation screen stack up. I didn't tell Caitlin. As I shut down my laptop, one more thought slid in quiet and hard. If the people in that tower ever decided my mother was just set dressing for their story, I wanted something in my hands that they actually cared about. They had built their lives around control. Fame. Then control was the one thing I would be ready to touch. The morning after the wedding that never happened, I put on the same suit I'd worn to North Crest, tied the same tie, and drove to Aldridge Tower. The sky over Charlotte was gray and low, the kind of light that makes glass look like water about to break. Walking through the lobby, I could feel eyes on me. Overnight, the documentary crew's footage had taken on a life of its own. A shaky clip of me at the microphone, the line about what kind of people I never want to become, the sight of me leading my mother out of the ballroom. It had all leaked. People had watched it on their phones in bed. Now they watched me in person, waiting to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. Security cleared me with the same badge I'd always used. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt shorter than usual. When the doors slid open, Gregory's assistant was already standing there, pale and rigid. "They're in the main conference room," she said. "They asked for you as soon as you arrived." Inside the room was full. Gregory and Victoria at one end of the table, Caitlin beside her motherboard members arranged in an uneasy semicircle. A few unfamiliar men in sharp suits sat near the far wall, lawyers from the look of them. The city glittered behind the glass, oblivious. For a moment no one spoke. They were all waiting for the same thing. The apology, the explanation, the backpedal. The prodigal almost son, pleading for a way back in. I set the leather folder I was carrying down on the glossy table and pulled out a chair halfway down the side. Not at the head, not at the foot. "Before we start," I said, "there's a small change we need to put on the record." Gregory's jaw tightened. "The only change I'm interested in hearing is that you understand what you did last night," he said. "Oh, I do," I said. "But this isn't about the wedding." I opened the folder and laid out a neat stack of notarized documents, transfer confirmations, and updated shareholder registers. As of yesterday, entities under my control hold 55% of Aldridge Development Group's voting shares. For a second, the only sound in the room was the hum of the HVS. Then chairs scraped. Someone cursed under their breath. One of the lawyers leaned forward to read the top page, his face going slack as he absorbed the details. Gregory shoved his chair back so hard it nearly tipped. "What is this?" he shouted. "Some stunt. You can't just walk in here and declare yourself king because you embarrassed my family at a party." I'm not declaring anything, I said, keeping my voice level. I bought in fair market, willing sellers for months. You were busy polishing the narrative. I was reading the footnotes. Victoria's face had gone almost translucent. Caitlin had stood up without realizing it, one hand pressed to the table as if she needed it to stay upright. You're trying to punish us, Victoria whispered over a comment. Over your mother. I bought my part of the company because you were already using my name and work as decoration, I said. The way you talked about my mother in those rooms was just confirmation of how little you value the people your stories rest on. Behind me a chair scraped again. He's not bluffing, one of the board members muttered. These are real. I caught a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. Caitlin stepped closer, voice quiet, but clear enough for the room to hear. I knew, she said. I saw some of the transfer paperwork last week. The words hit like a second shockwave. I turned to her. You knew what I was doing and said nothing. She swallowed. I wanted to tell you, she said. My mother told me if I did, you'd think I was only with you because of what you could take from us. She said, if you found out I'd seen the documents, it would ruin everything. She said, to stay out of it. And you listened, I said. She nodded, eyes rimmed with red. I was trying not to make it worse. That's the problem, I said softly. You keep mistaking silence for peace. At the far end of the table, one of the younger board members stood up. He was maybe a few years younger than me, with Gregory's jawline and none of his polish. I'd seen him at functions, but never paid much attention. Always half in his father's shadow. I'm the one who sent the documents, he said, looking straight at me. The internal budgets, the contractor lists, the invoices that don't match anything on the ground. Gregory spun on him. You did what? I have watched you sign deals that made no sense for years, the younger man said, voice shaking but steady. You taught me to read the numbers. Remember. I did. And they stank. You used our name to launder garbage. I'm done pretending not to see it. The room fractured into overlapping voices, accusations, denials, a lawyer trying to restore order. Through it all, the fact remained. The stack of papers in front of me, the percentage on the page, the votes that now answered to my hand. Here's what's going to happen, I said, finally raising my voice just enough to cut through the noise. Effective immediately. Gregory, you are suspended from your role as CEO pending an independent review. Victoria, your authority to sign new contracts on behalf of the company is revoked until further notice. An external audit of every major project for the past 3 years starts this week. All relationships with the Lincoln District contractors flagged in these documents are frozen until they can be verified. You don't have the right, Gregory snarled. I have the votes, I said. You taught me that's what matters in this room. I turned to Caitlin. You will step away from all public-facing roles. No more speeches. No more being the face of Lincoln or any other project until we know exactly what's been promised in your name. If you want to stay, it'll be on terms that don't involve selling anyone's backstory, including mine. She blinked hard, jaw trembling, then sat down slowly. I gathered the remaining documents from the folder and pulled out one last file. There's one more thing, I said. Something that isn't about cash flow or contracts. I spread a series of photos across the table. Grainy telephoto shots of my mother leaving the salon in Raleigh. My mother at the grocery store reading labels. My mother sitting alone in our booth at Maple Lane Diner. Hands wrapped around a mug. Attached was an invoice from a private investigations firm addressed to a holding company tied back to Victoria. When did following my mother around with a camera become part of your event planning? Yes. Victoria's composure cracked. We needed background, she said weakly. For the documentary, for the charity angle. People respond to human details. She's not a detail, I said, each word harder than the one before it. She's a person. You turned her into a character in a script designed to make you look generous. You trailed her through her life like she was a specimen, and then you stood in a ballroom and called her a mistake in a dress. For the first time that morning my voice shook. Let it. That ends now, I said. From this point forward, this company does not use anyone's life as a prop. Not mine, not hers, not any neighborhood you build in. Every contract, every project, every so-called community partnership will be documented, audited, and open to scrutiny. If that's too much daylight for anyone in this room, there's the door. Sell your shares. You'll find a buyer. No one moved. Outside the glass, the city kept on breathing. Cars crawling along streets. People crossing intersections. Kids sitting in classrooms that didn't know or care who ran Aldridge Development. Inside, the air felt thinner. The shine stripped away from the table, leaving only wood and fingerprints. I gathered the photos of my mother and slid them back into the folder, then closed it. When I walked out of the conference room, a wall of cameras was already forming near the elevators. Reporters shouted my name, flinging questions about corporate upheaval and family drama. I didn't stop. Security cleared a path, and as the elevator doors slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of the tower lobby, all marble and reflection. They had dragged my mother's life into their story without her consent, confident no one would ever hold them accountable. Now they were going to learn what it felt like to have every corner of their empire lit up, whether they were ready or not. The audit report landed on my desk in a room that used to belong to Gregory. His name was still faintly visible where they'd taken the plaque off the door. Outside the window, Charlotte looked calm. Cars sliding along streets, cranes frozen over future towers. Inside, my hands smelled like printer ink and coffee, and every page I turned felt heavier than paper. The independent firm had moved fast. 1 week after the boardroom showdown, they handed me a preliminary report thick enough to crack a table. Lincoln District was on the first tab, highlighted in yellow. Millions had gone out to contractors who existed only as mailboxes and bank accounts. No crews, no equipment, no sign of work beyond the staged photos Aldridge had used in their brochures. 2 other major projects showed the same pattern, exceptions to public bidding rules. Signatures pushed through under urgent circumstances, money vanishing into the fog. I sat in that borrowed office until my eyes burned, reading line after line of polite accounting language that translated to something simple. They'd been draining the city and covering it with landscaping and speeches. Every instinct in me wanted to slam the folder shut and walk into Gregory's house with a report in my hand. Instead, I did what the role required. I signed off on sending the findings to the City Council Oversight Committee. I authorized an internal notice freezing questionable contracts. I put my name under decisions I knew would put a target on my back. The leak came faster than I expected. A regional architecture blog somehow got a summary of the report and ran a story about irregularities in Aldridge's flagship projects. Local Charlotte papers picked it up, adding their own spice. They mentioned the cancelled wedding at North Crest like it was a side plot in some prestige drama. By Monday, the national outlets arrived. CNBC ran a segment with a split screen, Aldridge Tower on one side, a still from the leaked wedding video on the other. Bloomberg pushed a headline about family real estate empire shaken by would-be son-in-law turned majority shareholder. People texted me links like they were sending congratulations. I didn't feel proud. I felt like I'd ripped off a bandage that had been covering the same wound for years and now had to look at what was underneath. Then the full wedding footage hit the internet. Someone from the documentary crew, maybe fed up, maybe just greedy, sold a cut of the night to a gossip site. There was Victoria in high definition, champagne glass lit just right, saying, "That's not a mother. That's a mistake in a dress." There was Caitlin laughing, saying, "Careful," without ever actually stopping anything. There was me walking to the microphone, shoulders tight, tie straight, ending the wedding in 3 sentences. Comments exploded. Some people called me a traitor who had used intimate access to stage a takeover. Others said I did what any decent son should have done the second his mother was turned into a punchline. Think pieces sprouted overnight about class optics and what happens when the people under the spotlight decide to turn it around. I read enough of the comments to understand something simple. Once you drag truth out into the open, you don't get to manage how people arrange it in their heads. A week later, a fund that had once courted Aldridge asked to meet me in Chicago. We sat in a glass box overlooking the river, the kind of conference room I'd spent years being impressed by. The man across from me wore a watch that cost more than the first City Pulse pilot. He slid a neat folder across the table. "We think Aldridge is salvageable," he said. "With the right stewardship. With you." The folder outlined a rescue, fresh capital, debt restructured, a new logo and slogan about renewal. Buried in the language was the real offer. The audit results could be contextualized. The worst of the findings could be handled internally. In exchange, we would keep the story tidy. No criminal referrals, no public hearings, no more messy headlines about mothers and mistakes and dresses. I'd sit at the top of a cleaned-up company and everyone else would go back to making money. For a minute I saw it. City Pulse plugged into a well-funded machine. Parks and plazas paid for with money that didn't have to come from scraping grants together. No more ramen. No more duct tape space heaters. Then I saw my mother on that screen again, frozen mid-step in a borrowed dress, and the photos of her taken from across parking lots by people who thought they owned her narrative. I saw the memo that called me a storytelling asset and the benches in Chicago that still had no shade. "If I soften this," I said, closing the folder, "all I've done is swap Gregory's name for mine on the door. The same people get ground up, just under new branding." "You're being emotional," he said. "I'm being clear," I replied. "If they did the work, they can prove it. If they didn't, the city deserves to know. You want a safe bet? Invest somewhere else." Later that week, Caitlin showed up at the City Pulse office without warning. The afternoon light came in low through the big warehouse windows, catching dust motes and the edge of the L train as it screeched past. My team went silent when she walked through, recognizing her face from headlines. She looked smaller somehow. No perfect blowout, no curated outfit, just jeans, a sweater, and the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes. "I didn't know," she said as soon as I closed the door to the small conference room. "Not all of it. I saw adjusted numbers, sure, but I thought it was the usual games. I didn't know about ghost contractors or your mother being followed." "You knew enough to know what was wrong," I said. "You grew up in those rooms. You know what real costs look like." She flinched. "I was scared," she said. "I tried to back out of the wedding once months ago. I told my mother I couldn't do it. That I didn't want to drag you into all of this." She said, "If I walked away, I walked away from everything. Family, shares, influence." She said, "If I married you and you stepped up, we could fix things from inside." Chose that. I chose them. I leaned against the table, feeling the old wood under my palms. "You didn't just choose them at North Crest," I said. "You chose them when you laughed. You chose them every time you saw something crooked and called it how things work." I can understand being trapped. I grew up trapped. But when the moment came, you protected your seat at that table. Not my mother, not the neighborhoods under your projects. Your seat. Tears slid down her face, but her voice stayed steady. "I loved you," she said. "I still do. I loved the version of you that stood on that panel in Chicago and argued about benches and public light." I said, "I thought you wanted to build cities that felt different from the ones your parents made, but when it mattered, you protected their comfort over my mother's dignity, over your own voice." "So that's it," she whispered. He nodded. "If you stay silent when people step on my mother, you'll stay silent when they step on people like her. I can't build anything on that." When she walked out past the City Pulse desks, no one clapped or whispered. They just watched, the way people do when they see a door closing on a version of the future that might have been. I stood at the window and watched the train go by and reminded myself why I had ever started any of this. Not to win, not to punish, but to make sure the next kid from a strip mall salon didn't have to trade their spine for a seat. By the end of that week, the city of Charlotte made it official. Aldridge Group was off the preferred vendor list. Several of their contracts were reopened for competitive bidding. Oversight committees announced hearings. The headlines moved on the way they always do. Inside, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt for once like my silence wasn't part of the harm. The formal notice from the city arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning. No dramatic language, no moral judgment, just bullet points and letterhead. Aldridge Group removed from pre-approved vendor roster. Certain contracts to be rebid under open procedures. Referral of audit findings to appropriate authorities. News outlets did their recaps. Gregory resigned for personal reasons. Victoria quietly stepped down from every board she sat on. A few senior executives took sudden sabbaticals in countries with no extradition treaties. Commentators called it a reckoning. To me, it felt more like a cold, necessary reset. The people I kept thinking about were the junior analysts, the site supervisors, the assistants at reception. People who had done nothing worse than stay employed in a system they didn't design. Once the emergency measures were in place, I did something a lot of people called stupid. I stepped back. We created an interim governance structure for Aldridge. Technocrats, community representatives, a liaison from the city. I kept majority control on paper to prevent another quiet hijacking, but I refused the CEO title. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life deciding which tower got clad in which imported stone. Instead, I went back to Chicago, to City Pulse, to the neighborhoods that had trusted us before anyone at Aldridge knew my name. And I started building something that felt like the opposite of what I just burned through. We called it the L Foundation. On the paperwork, it was just a letter. On the inside, everyone close to me knew it stood for Linda. Mom hated the idea of her name on anything, so I compromised. An initial, not a full monument. The mission was simple. Scholarships, microgrants, and mentorship for kids from neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. Places where the only thing bigger than the potholes was the list of things people said you'd never do. We launched the foundation in Chicago, not Charlotte, in a community center built on what had once been a trash-strewn lot City Pulse helped convert. The basketball lines on the floor were still bright. Outside, the mural kids from the neighborhood had painted wrapped around the building in blues and oranges. The crowd was small. A couple of local officials, some reporters, a handful of high school students who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, but had shown up because a counselor promised pizza afterward. Mom sat in the second row wearing a dress she'd bought on sale and altered in the kitchen the night before. Hands folded tight in her lap. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about Aldridge or audits. I talked about a boy doing homework on salon tiles, about coupons cut at midnight, about a woman who carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs and still found the breath to ask how your day went. I said I didn't grow up with a family fund or land deeds. I grew up with a blow dryer that overheated every 6 months and a mother who refused to let me see hard work as something to hide. Then the MC did the one thing I'd begged them not to and asked Mrs. Hale to come up for a moment. Mom shook her head at first, but the room clapped, and eventually she shuffled up beside me, smoothing her dress the way she always did when she wanted to look like she belonged. She took the mic with 2 hands and said, "I don't know about foundations and projects. I just know my son used to sit on the floor of my salon doing homework between haircuts. If now some other kids get to do their homework somewhere bigger and brighter than that, then every hour I stood on my feet was worth it." That was it. No slogans, no campaign-style line. Just the truth, plain and heavy as a hand on your shoulder. It meant more to me than every plaque I'd picked up since leaving Akron. A few days later, I met the person who'd lit the fuse from inside Aldridge, the younger son, Gregory's kid from a previous marriage. The one who had stood up in the boardroom. He was in Chicago on business and emailed me to meet at a corner cafe that didn't serve anything with foam art. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said, staring into his coffee. "I just thought you should know what's happening with the pieces." He told me the Aldridge portfolio was being broken up. Properties sold off, some to competitors, some to community trusts under pressure from regulators. A portion of the proceeds, small but not symbolic, was being routed into local funds, including a commitment to match donations to the L Foundation for the first few years. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I grew up in the same house you just took apart. I benefited from it. But I couldn't keep watching him sign things I knew would hurt people. Trying to fix the ship after years at the wheel is still better than pretending it was never drifting," I said. "But it doesn't erase the wake." He nodded. We shook hands like two men who shared a fire they'd both helped feed and put out in different ways. Sometime after all that, on a night when the city felt too loud, I drove Mom back to Maple Lane Diner. Same cracked parking lot, same flickering neon, same booth with a duct tape on the seat. The waitress refilled our mugs without asking and slid a slice of pie between us the way she had years ago. "You know," Mom said, stirring her tea, "you could have just walked out of that wedding and left it at that. You didn't have to do everything else." I looked at her, at the lines time had pressed into her face, deeper now than they'd been under the North Crest chandeliers. "If I'd stopped at the door of that estate," I said, "they'd still be telling their version of the story. They'd still be using people like you as decoration. The next kid from a strip mall salon walking into their boardroom would still be a prop, not a partner. I couldn't live with that." She sighed, not quite agreeing, not quite arguing, and took a sip of tea. For the first time in my life, I noticed something small. She wasn't glancing around like she was waiting to be judged. She was just there in her booth, in her skin. Not a mistake in a dress. Just Linda, who had survived all of it. Sometimes late at night, I replay 3 scenes in my head. The moment at North Rest when that sentence sliced through the air. The boardroom in Aldridge Tower with glass on 3 sides and rot in the paperwork. This sticky table at Maple Lane where my mother once split a $5 dessert in half so I'd have something sweet to work toward. If it had been you, where would you have stopped? At the ballroom door? At the glass-walled conference room? Or right here at a diner booth with coffee stains older than both of us, telling yourself it wasn't your fight? Did I go too far? Or did I just walk the stretch everyone always expects people like me to crawl through quietly? I'm not asking for approval. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to think about this. If one day someone pointed at your mother and called her a mistake in a dress, what would you do? And how far would you go to make sure they never did it again to anyone?